A very warm welcome to all of you from London. My name is Ilona Regulski. I'm the curator for Egyptian written culture at the Department of Egypt and Sudan in the British Museum. And tonight I will tell you a little bit about our exhibition, Hieroglyphs Unlocking Ancient Egypt. I am joined by Kelly Accetta Crowe, who is our project curator and who will take over halfway through the lecture. This is a lecture in a series. The next event will be also on the Rosetta Stone, Champollion and Ancient Languages on the 10th of November. Details can be found on the British Museum website. And if you are happy with the talk of tonight, I would suggest you join again. If you're not happy, I would suggest also you join again on the 10th of November. And we're very, very happy that we have so many people joining us tonight, so many people who are interested in hieroglyphs. And just perhaps one more housekeeping remark before we start. If you have questions, please leave them in the Q&A box rather than the chat. This is easier for us to digest them after the lecture. Okay, so Egyptian hieroglyphs have always intrigued people as this witness of an ancient civilization. Every aspect of Egyptian culture, its religious practice, monumental buildings, administrative details it relied on a system of writing that developed around 3250 BC. That is a very long time ago. But their picture-like nature hid the fact that they represented a complex spoken language. This spoken language lived on until the 15th century, 16th century, and actually in a way still until present day, because it's still used in the Coptic Church. And this makes it one of history's longest surviving spoken languages. But following the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BC, the ancient scripts started to fall out of use, replaced by Greek first and then followed by Arabic. And as a new alphabet was used to write the ancient Egyptian language, which will develop into Coptic, the connection between the language and hieroglyphs vanished. Roman authors, Greek authors could not read hieroglyphs anymore, and also later scholars believed the hieroglyphs to be symbolic rather than linked to the sound of spoken language. And this is a belief that lived on until the 17th century and effectively obstructed decipherment for many centuries. And so began a journey of more than 1,000 years to unlock the hieroglyphic writing system. Too much trust was placed in classical sources and biblical sources, and the complexity of the language itself set back the process for many centuries until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which finally gave us this bilingual inscription where we had a known language, ancient Greek, that could be used to translate the Egyptian language. This is the story we want to tell in the exhibition. A brief overview of how this looks like in a layout. You can follow the story here. It's a little bit going through time, starting in the medieval period and the Arab world, going through the Egyptian, Arab medieval period, and then via the European Renaissance into the 17th dynasty, leading up to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. And then we explain quite in detail the race to decipherment, which hinged on Jean-François Champollion from France and Thomas Young for England. And other people, of course, played an important role and are also featured in this section. But it's really those two main protagonists that will unlock ancient Egypt for us. Champollion comes out the winner, and by deciphering hieroglyphs, uncovers this ancient civilization for us. And the last part of the exhibition talks about the impact on and the legacy of this decipherment. So how do we know so much more about ancient Egypt now that we can read the written sources? In the exhibition, thereby, we also go from formal to informal. So as the earliest engagement with hieroglyphs was very much about reading royal names, we are now more interested in the lives of the people. And so gradually, as you progress through the exhibition, you will come down to those very personal stories. We start our story in Egypt itself because, of course, they were the first to be encountered or to be surrounded by colorful hieroglyphs in temples, in tombs, but also in objects that were just sitting on the banks of the Nile. As you can see here, one example is the sarcophagus of Hapmen, which was just sitting somewhere in present-day Cairo, and people who passed by attributed magical powers to these hieroglyphs. And the story went that if you would bathe in this sarcophagus, you would be cured of love sickness. So the hieroglyphs would somehow work their magic and you would be cured. This gave this sarcophagus the name the Enchanted Basin, in Arabic El Hout El Marsoud. My apologies for my pronunciation if there's any Arabic speakers listening, but this name is still used today for the area in Cairo where this sarcophagus was found. Arab medieval travelers also refer to the Egyptian language or the script as the letters of the birds. As you can see, many hieroglyphs are in the shape of birds. They also already made the very important connection between Coptic, which was at the time in the medieval period still spoken by Coptic monks, and whenever an ancient text was found, the Arab scholars would rush to the Coptic scholars or the Coptic monks to ask them to translate. But even though Coptic is the remnant of ancient Egyptian language, they couldn't read hieroglyphs anymore. As Arabic gained ascendancy, the Copts were a bit afraid that they would lose their language, and they start copying Arabic manuscripts into Arabic. And here we see an example of that, where we have an interesting mix between Arabic, Coptic, and very often also Greek. So there was a conscious effort to preserve the Coptic script by these early scholars, which is really very valuable and provided very valuable sources for later scholars who will use these manuscripts to study the ancient language. In this case, this is a papyrus, an alchemical text. So there was very much the belief that the ancient Egyptians were the masters of alchemy. Here we have references to the sun being gold and so on, which often is wrong, but as we know, alchemy will develop into chemistry and so into a proper science. One of the important scholars to mention here is Ibn Warshia, who came very close to identifying some of the hieroglyphs correctly. But as I said, most of the positive contributions or steps in the right directions made by Arabic scholars was the connection with Coptic, and also they understood already that hieroglyphs also had a handwritten version, which we nowadays refer to by hieratic and demotic, and they said there's different scripts to write one language, which was all very important information, and yeah, information that later scholars will very much build on. A scholar like Ibn Warshia is mostly preserved in secondary literature, so which is a bit difficult sometimes to interpret, but his work was very popular. It was translated in many different languages, and these are again works that later scholars would use. Another very important source was the dialogues of Hermes Trismegistos. This was a legendary figure based on the god Thoth, the god of writing in ancient Egypt, who could be represented as a baboon or as an ibis. You see both examples here. And then in the middle of this object on your left, you see Hermes, the Greek form of this legendary figure slash god. And he was credited with having invented writing. And it's very interesting to see how this legendary figure is picked up by different traditions, by different religions, who try to give this figure and his writings a place in their own tradition. So, for example, Muslim scholars will compare Hermes with the prophet Idris in the Quran, who is also thought to have invented writing. We then move to the European scholars and into the Renaissance, where much of the same sources were used. But what really kick-started interest in Egypt in let's say the beginning of the 15th century into the 16th century was the rediscovery of, again, Hermes Trismegistos dialogues, but also the manuscript of Hawara, who interpreted some of the hieroglyphs correctly. His Hieroglyphica that was published in 1419 was very influential, and he did read some signs correctly, but his interpretations were very much in the spirit of the Renaissance, where everything was interpreted in this kind of symbolic, naturalistic way. For example, here you see a hare, and the hieroglyph for hare, he said, means to open, which we know is correct, because indeed this is the way to write to open as a verb or as the participium, yeah, open. But his interpretation was really a bit misleading. He said, because the animal keeps his eyes wide open. So this is a very typical example of these fantastic interpretations during the Renaissance. Very important also was the rediscovery of ancient Egypt through small objects, not only through manuscripts. So we have a few on the slides here. Mainly small objects that made it to Europe in basically the suitcases of the earliest travelers. And we have the earliest cabinets of curiosities that start to develop, very small private collections where people were very intrigued by strange things, wondrous things, and ancient Egypt was very much part of that. And you see a few objects that have been circulating in Europe since a long time, since the beginning of the Renaissance period. I draw your attention to the beautiful bust on the lower left, which is currently in Naples. So we, in this first section, we have a lot of loans from Italy. We also start to see some of the objects that came to Italy, because at a certain point in time, Egypt was part of the Roman Empire, and these Roman emperors would bring objects back to to Italy, not least obelisks. And by the 15th century, they had fallen into ruin, but very much encouraged by the first popes, they are starting to be rediscovered, re-erected. And this was really the first moment in Europe that scholars or anyone interested in Egypt had the chance to look at monumental hieroglyphs, which was very unusual because we didn't have big museums. We didn't have the British Museum, or at least it was a very small place with small objects mostly. We didn't have the Louvre. So anyone interested in ancient Egypt would travel to Italy, and Rome in particular became a laboratory for Egyptian studies. Until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, which really provided this bilingual inscription that we needed. Already in the 17th century, scholars really explain and write in their correspondence that if only they had a bilingual inscription with the text in a known language, that could be it leads to the reading of the unknown language. And the discovery of the Rosetta Stone provides exactly that, because it has the same text in ancient Greek at the lower part, and 2 Egyptian scripts. The discovery is quite well known, but it's always interesting to repeat it. It was discovered by Napoleon's army, who invaded Egypt in 1798. And it was discovered in 1799 when the French army was reinforcing the forts on the north coast. This one was reused, the object was reused in the foundations of a fort in present-day Rashid. It's called Rosetta Stone because the French called the city Rosette, Little Rose, and so it became the Pierre de Rosette, Rosetta Stone in English. When the French army surrendered to the combined forces, which is a combination of the Egyptian British forces, of course, Egypt under Ottoman rule at the time, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, it was decided that 22 objects were to be handed over to the British and could be taken back to England. These 22 objects included the Rosetta Stone and were objects that were collected by the French scholars when they were in Egypt, because as we know, Napoleon added a lot of scholars to his expedition. So it was not only a military expedition, he also consciously wanted these scholars to document Egypt, its nature, its people, its customs, its monuments, and so on, which will lead later to the publication of the Description de l'Égypte, which is a little bit responsible in France for, again, accelerating this interest, this renewed interest in ancient Egypt. The stone arrives in the British Museum in 1802. This is an image of the fort as it is restored today, heavily restored, but it has this beautiful view over the Mediterranean. And this is the capitulation document in which it is outlined that these objects are to be handed over, and it's signed by the representatives of the three governments in question, so including the Egyptian one, again, of course, representing Ottoman rule in Egypt. Yes, I like to show this picture because it shows very clearly that when the stone and the other heavy, very heavy objects, the first sarcophagus that I showed you was part of the same group. When they arrived in the British Museum, it was very much a moment to expand because there was not really space in the old Montagu house for such big collections. And so the arrival of these objects also meant a lot for the history of the British Museum and encouraged the British Museum to expand and to become the big public institution it is today. And this is an old image of how it was displayed for a long time in one of the newly constructed galleries. What does a Rosetta Stone actually say? It is a priestly decree drawn up on the 27th of March, 196 BC, by a group of priests who come to the ancient city of Memphis. The king at the time was living in Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander the Great, and the king joins the priests in Memphis. This was a bit of a statement. They wanted to meet in the ancient capital and not in the new capital. And the text basically, in one very, very long sentence, explains that the king should be treated as a god, basically. His statue should be put up in the temple, should be carried around in processions. The priests should say that they're priests of the king in addition to priests of the gods, and so on. He deserved these divine honors because the king was very good for the country. He protected Egypt from invaders, from rebels. He restored temples. He founded new ones. He allowed huge allowances to the cult of the sacred animals. He lowered taxes, which is very popular, as you can imagine. And at the end of each text, which is 3 times the same text, of course, the decree tells us that this decree should be written in hard stone, in sacred writing, which we see at the top. This is the hieroglyphs, in document writing, and in Greek writing. This is the last sentence of the text. So the 3 scripts are mentioned in this last sentence, and it furthermore tells us that it should be set up in all the temples of Egypt. Whether this really happened or not, we don't know, but we do have 28 other copies of the Rosetta Stone, and in the exhibition and also here on your screen you see the family tree. Some of these were discovered very early on. The Rosetta Stone was the first, and that's why it led to the decipherment, but we have a lot of siblings. As you can see, the text, we have the earliest evidence of this text in 243 BC. It was used by Ptolemy III and then all the way to Ptolemy VI. Whether it was used earlier or later, we don't know. Maybe one day we will find another copy of this text. But as you can see on the right, copies were indeed discovered from the north in Egypt to the south. So it could very well have been that every temple had a copy of this inscription. So it was written on papyrus, sent around the country, and then copied for many, many times. So the text on the Rosetta Stone has many siblings. In the exhibition, we show it in addition with some of those copies from the Louvre, but most of those copies are still in Egypt today, and some of the best preserved ones are on display in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And this is a really nice additional story that we tell in the exhibition that we think that many visitors are maybe not so aware of. We can use some of these copies to reconstruct the top of the Rosetta Stone because, as you may see, the top is broken. We use the Nobera stela, which is, if I go back, I don't know if I can use a cursor. Are you seeing my mouse? No, okay. The one, it's one of the siblings of the Rosetta Stone. It's the Nobera stela, which is only in hieroglyphs, which is very unusual. Most of the other copies are also in 3 scripts. And we can use the top of the stela to suggest at least a reconstruction of the Rosetta Stone because the content of the text is so close. And so we think that also on the Rosetta Stone at the top, we see Ptolemy V stabbing an enemy. In front of him is the god Shu, who hands the sword of victory, followed by his wife Tefnut, so 2 gods, and then followed by Ptolemy's ancestors. This is a close-up. It's a suggestion. We can't be certain, but this is a new reconstruction that we at least propose for the Rosetta Stone. With the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, hope soared that those ancient voices could be brought back to life through the Greek version of this text, and especially in combination with the evidence that was available already in the from the Coptic language. These several scholars started to work on the Rosetta Stone. This proved harder than was anticipated, and it will take another 23 years for the hieroglyphic writing system to be deciphered. As I said, there's really two main protagonists. On the left, Jean-François Champollion for France, and on the right, Thomas Young for England. Their work overlapped in many ways, and for a long time they developed in the same direction, but they also differed in method and in persistence, each attracting supporters and critics as they came closer to their goal. I show you a few quotes of both scholars, which really gives a very good impression of their character, of their approach. Champollion saw the decipherment very much as a way to enter ancient Egypt, a way to understand the ancient Egyptian culture, whereas for Thomas Young, it was really more like an intellectual challenge. Thomas Young was a polymath, he was a physician, he was interested in the theory of light, musical harmony, and so on. And so he was very distracted by many other things, and he did Egyptology in his leisurely hours. So he joined the race also later than Champollion. He's much older, and he didn't really believe that Coptic would be a big help to the decipherment. And in fact, he didn't have the same interest in ancient Egypt than Champollion, as was very common for the day. He saw Greece and Rome very much as the predecessors of our European history, and couldn't really appreciate that there would be an older civilization that was sophisticated enough to develop a very complicated writing system. And there was a little bit of disrespect even towards this other strange culture. They did not only use the Rosetta Stone, but many other objects, and some of them are on display in the exhibitions. The same problem then as their predecessors was the lack of material. The objects with Egyptian inscriptions in Europe are still very limited, very small objects still, like the mummy label you see at the top, mummy wrappings that were distributed during events that were mummy unwrapping events. So you could buy a ticket, and then you could receive a piece of the linen, preferably with writing on it. This really didn't happen so much anymore in the time of Champollion and Thomas Young. This is much earlier, but these mummy wrappings were distributing in Europe and were very much favorite objects in those cabinets of curiosities, those private collections that Thomas Young and Champollion were visiting and were getting the resources from. In addition to that, also those medieval manuscripts that I mentioned earlier, Champollion was fluent in Arabic and of course had by this time also learned Coptic pretty well. So he had access to these dictionaries that were written in Arabic Coptic. And I find it quite interesting that you have a known language to access another known language, a known language that was not even Champollion's native language. So he was really very much a language prodigy. And then on the left, a beautiful drawing of a relief in the tomb of Seti I. So at this time, in the beginning of the 19th century, travel to Egypt had increased, and a lot of scholars who go to Egypt bring back notes and copies of inscriptions, and there was a lot of discussion between scholars about the accuracy of those copies, and it was very important to try to copy the inscriptions as much as accurate as possible, and to distribute them among the scholars. So they really didn't have much available, and Thomas Champollion complains a lot about the inaccuracy of the copies that he has. We are lucky to be able to display some of their handwritten notes that are preserved in the National Libraries of London, in our case, the British Library, and the National Library in Paris, in the case of Champollion. And it's very nice because it brings us very close to the people who are really doing the work, and we can see their handwriting, and we can understand a little bit of their methods, how they were working. So on the left, you see how Champollion dissects, if you want, the demotic text into pieces, and then tries to write the Coptic equivalent underneath it in an attempt to read the Demotic phonetically. Also, Thomas Young started with Demotic, and both also worked on Demotic and hieroglyphs at the same time, which is also something that we should not forget, is that a lot more work actually had been done on Demotic than on hieroglyphs. But they both find the Rosetta Stone very difficult, and especially Champollion complains about it and starts looking at other texts very soon. For example, this papyrus, which was brought back to Paris by one of the scholars in the expedition of Napoleon. Napoleon. So, for example, this one was owned by Vivant de Nom. And the mistake that Champollion made was he compared this script with the script on the middle part of the Rosetta Stone, which of course didn't lead him anywhere, because this is hieratic and not demotic. So again, he can't really make sense of the text, and he says to his brother that he really can't read this, it's very difficult, and he's about to give up, and then focuses a lot on the Coptic. In the meantime, travelers are still going around in Egypt, and William John Banks discovers a missing link, the obelisk in Philae that he visits in 1814 and then brings back to put in his garden, basically, where it still is today in Kingston Lacy. And this obelisk gives us the name of Cleopatra, and this really provides a very important missing link, because they start comparing the name of Ptolemy in the Rosetta Stone with Cleopatra. On the top of the slide, and I go over this decipherment efforts a little bit more quickly, because it's explained in the exhibition in much detail, and it's actually it's quite complicated. But the key thing is that Thomas Young at a certain point analyzes the name, the royal name of Ptolemy, as Ptolemaios, as you can see here, and he reads some letters as alphabetic and some letters as syllables, which is partly correct and partly wrong. He publishes this in 1819, which very much worries Champollion, and he says this is the decipherment. But when they have the cartouche of Cleopatra, actually Champollion says, well, Cleopatra shares clearly 4 hieroglyphs with the name of Ptolemaios, and therefore the reading of these syllables cannot be correct, because you wouldn't be able to use them in the same sense as Cleopatra. So he refines Thomas Young's reading of Ptolemy or Ptolemaios in this way, and thereby really establishing the alphabet of ancient Egyptian. Ancient Egyptian is not alphabetic, but it does use a lot of alphabetic letters in foreign names and in a lot of other words. So by this method, Champollion was able to build up an alphabet that he publishes in the famous Dacier letter. But he makes another discovery, and he concludes that the Egyptian writing system is conservative. So if this phonetic spelling, namely spelling based on spoken language, was available for Greco-Roman names, for foreign names, then it must also be there from the very beginning. And he tests his readings, his new alphabet that he has just discovered, together with the knowledge he has of Coptic, by reading names of other pharaohs. And he finds, he probably, I think, saw this drawing by Huyot from the temple at Abu Simbel, and he reads the first sign that you see here as the sun disk, and he knew that this was Ra from Coptic. The 2 lower signs are S. He knew this from the name Ptolemaios, and so he says Ra Meses. This must be the name of Ramses, who was known from the Bible, and he's not only able to read pharaonic names at this point, but he also discovers the hybrid nature of ancient Egyptian writing, that in one name or in one word you have the combination of hieroglyphic letters, 1 letter signs, which you could call alphabetic, but also hieroglyphs that could represent an entire word, such as Ra, the sun disk. And so this combination of words, logograms, as we say, and individual 1-letter alphabetic signs is really the key to be able to read hieroglyphs. And this is when he runs to his brother, he throws his papers in the air, and he says, "I've got it," and he faints for a few days. At this point, Champollion has run out of resources. He has read every possible inscription that is available in France, and so he starts to travel to find more resources and to refine the system. And at this point, I hand over to my colleague Kelly.
Thank you. So one of the most interesting parts of Champollion's method is that he wants to test it on all sorts of ancient Egyptian material to make sure he's correct about how he can read hieroglyphs. Unfortunately, as Ilona mentioned, he runs out of material to read in Paris. He's so very thorough, and he realizes he has to go further abroad to find more things to read. In 1828, he finally gets to indulge in his lifelong ambition of actually going to Egypt, to be able to read things in situ. While he's there, he travels to a town called Abydos, where he visits the temple of Ramses II and sees this object in person. This is known as the Abydos King List. It was created by Ramses II. It features his name all along the bottom of the list, but before that, in the registers above, it features all the names of the predecessors of him, so all the kings that came before him. As Champollion's translating these 77 names of kings that are listed on this relief, he realizes he's pushing time back many hundreds, in fact, many thousands of years, 3,000 years, in fact, earlier than many people thought human history was beginning. This brings him into a bit of conflict with the Catholic Church at the time, as he's essentially contributing to a 19th century movement that portrays the historical reliability of the Bible as hostile to science and progress. But that doesn't stop him. He obviously continues to pursue his knowledge of truth, whatever it takes. Champollion was the first to grasp the structural logic of the ancient Egyptian language in its many forms, and this provides the tools for further explorations for scholars in generations to come. He granted the world entry into a distant but intriguing creative past. He spent his last years exploring this after he returned from Egypt, translating inscriptions until he died at a very young age of 41 in 1832. The vista of discovery he opened for the rest of us was staggering. Now, the work didn't end with decipherment in 1822 or even after the death of Champollion. Scholars in Egypt and around the world continued to refine and work on translating hieroglyphs and the Egyptian languages and revealing more about the lived lives of these ancient people. The final section of the exhibition, that is entitled The Rediscovering Ancient Egypt, looks at the history and the impact of Champollion's work and the work of other scholars that came after him. And it shows how we have used the past 200 years to really understand Egyptian culture and how these people lived and died. What we wanted to do in this last section is take you through 5 concepts that we think people are relatively familiar with when it comes to ancient Egypt, and show you how understanding the writing system, being able to read what these people have left behind, has really revealed in their own words the lives of ancient Egyptians. So I'm going to go through with you those 5 sections now. The first one is entitled Pharaoh and Empire. So Champollion and the scholars that followed him discovered a country that was an important power in the ancient Middle East, one with imperial ambitions. And like all empires, Egypt's interactions with his neighbors were sometimes aggressive and other times peaceful. They waged war, they had negotiations, they traded with their neighbors, and of course they traveled between each other's countries. Foreigners arrived in Egypt from these other neighboring countries as translators, traders, merchants, etc., and they settled in Egypt and brought their languages with them. An interesting example of this can be seen on the left. So this is a cuneiform tablet, one of many that forms a corpus that we know as the Amarna letters. Now, these tablets were part of official correspondence between the kings of Egypt and the rulers of the vassal states of the ancient Near East. This one in particular is actually negotiating a marriage between one of these foreign kings and the ruling king of Egypt at the time. Interestingly enough, below the cuneiform, we actually see a notation in an Egyptian script called hieratic, one of these cursive scripts that Ilona mentioned. And this is actually kind of noting some of the information that is in the cuneiform above. So we have proof that we have not only letters being sent back and forth in different languages, but there must also be translators present in the courts that can read these to the king, because not all the kings obviously could read all of the foreign languages of the people they interacted with. On the right, we have a gentleman who kind of embodies this idea of this in-between status of someone who's somewhat foreign, but also Egyptian, and bringing their language and their culture with them. This is a statue of a gentleman named Nebhebitra. He's a Medjay from the temple of Amun-Re in Karnak. So the Medjay were a semi-nomadic people. They lived in the eastern deserts near the Nile. But the name also became synonymous with the word for police in ancient Egypt because the Egyptians recruited these people to patrol the deserts. So they were there to make sure the desert roads were kept safe for travelers and traders. They also protected wealthy institutions such as temples and cemeteries that were often located right at the desert edge. So Egypt was in some ways portraying themselves as a very strong power, aggressive towards their neighbors, but at the same time, we're finding the truth in the people who are really living in Egypt is that there's a lot of mixing going along. A lot of these languages are coming in and influencing Egyptian. We move on to something that we call the concept of time. Champollion and the scholars that came after him didn't just decipher a writing system, they uncovered one of the oldest written languages in all of human history. And this achievement revealed to us how the ancient Egyptians measured time, how they organized the year, they commemorated their ancestors. There's a wealth of written sources that confirm a deep appreciation for the past by the ancient Egyptians themselves. One of the oldest inscriptions that we actually have at the British Museum is this one on the left on a jar. It dates to 3100 BC and it contains the name of the king. Early writing in Egypt, we believe, evolved to assist things with trading and the moving of objects between areas. And often things were inscribed with the name of the king at the time and what's inside the object or a label, so what the label is for. This one preserves the name of the king, but we're not entirely sure what was inside, unfortunately. The ancient Egyptians also aligned themselves with the achievements of their ancestors, so you could be considered quite great if you were related to an ancestor who was great himself. They reflected on their history by commemorating them or possibly sometimes reusing things, so statues or coffins that their ancestors reused, which could sometimes be considered aligning yourself with your ancestor and with their prestigiousness. But they also use these objects to erase people from history. So we see the statue of the gentleman on the right. He is dedicated by a man whose name is now lost. In the area with the yellow circle, we see it's been dug out. And what happened, we think, is that this man, he shared a name with the god Amun. And during the period directly after the statue was created, the king Akhenaten banned all other gods except for the Aten. So anything with the name Amun in it was considered forbidden, and they were hacked out. Now, the consequence being, of course, that this gentleman has not just been hacked out because of Amun, but his name, his identity, his history has been lost to us. So quite effective in erasing history as well as creating it. The ancient Egyptians also had similar concepts of time to us. They kept calendars. Champollion discovered this quite early on, and he writes to his brother in 1824 that he found out that the Egyptian year was divided into 12 months, very similar to ours, but their month had 30 days, and it was arranged into 3 seasons. Akhet, the season of flooding, Heret, the season of growing, and Shemu, the season of harvest. On this object, which is actually kind of a dual purpose object, so the front is a commemorative statue of the gentleman who dedicated it to his parents, and on the back we see a festival calendar. So this actually lists the feasts at the beginning of the year. There are 2 New Year's feasts. We know from lists like these that the Egyptians celebrated quite a lot and often quite drunkenly. So like us, they still had parties, they still had dates in their calendar that were very important to them. Of course, one of the most powerful forces in ancient Egypt, as many people know, was the concept of the afterlife. It influenced objects, architecture, and imagery in ancient Egypt. But again, our understanding of how Egyptians lived and died was really long hampered by a lack of understanding of the texts themselves. This beautiful papyrus that you see on the screen in front of you is part of a Book of the Dead of a queen named Nejmet. It's actually only a portion of it. It's over 4 meters long, but in total, the papyrus would have been more than 14 meters long, and another portion is in the Louvre. In this papyrus, we see one of the most important concepts of the Egyptian afterlife, and that is the weighing of the heart ceremony. So after you died, in order to make sure you got into the afterlife, into the field of reeds, which is the equivalent of the Egyptian heaven, you had to have your heart weighed against the feather of truth. This feather was also embodied by the goddess of truth, Maat. And you can see on this scale in the image, she is on the left, Maat, and the woman whose heart is being weighed is a miniature version of her on the right. Now, if your heart was heavier than the feather, you were essentially eaten, your heart was eaten by a demon and you are eternally damned. At this moment in the Book of the Dead, Amenemhat shows herself as being even with the feather, which is the result you want, and she's waiting before a baboon, who is the god Thoth, who will write down and record how it ends up. However, we know exactly how it would have ended up, and that's because we actually have a letter written about Amenemhat by her son that's in Berlin, and in this letter we found out that she actually coordinated the murder of 2 policemen. So if this is revealed during her judgment, she would definitely have ended up in eternal damnation. Now, the afterlife isn't just something for the dead. Of course, there was a huge industry around the afterlife, just as there is a funerary industry today. And working in the necropolis was a very lucrative business. The rights to mummies and tombs and income accrued was very competitive. Embalmers often formed unions in order to prevent battle between them, but disagreements still happened. This is an ostraca. So an ostraca is a fragment of pottery or stone that was then used to write on, kind of like scrap paper. And in this ostraca, we have a bit of a draft of an oath where 2 embalmers got in an argument about who was entitled to the burial. One who thought he was entitled bricked up the entrance to the burial, but he later on turned out to be the loser in the argument, and he had to sign an oath reneging all rights to that burial and giving it back to the proper embalmer. So we do have, of course, these controversies, which is quite lovely insight into how everyday life was in ancient Egypt, even in the funerary realm. We then move on to personal stories about family and society. So these are things perhaps that we can relate to a little bit more ourselves. And for many people, they probably don't think of cracking jokes and writing love poetry as far as ancient Egyptian culture. But thanks to decipherment, we know that the Egyptians were a lot like us. They sent letters, they got married and divorced, they negotiated business deals, they were concerned about their family and their health. And a lot of this passion, politics, and personal belief has been overshadowed by, of course, the big temple reliefs and a lot of things that people associate with monumental buildings in Egypt. But thanks to our ability to decipher and read these objects, we know that there's a lot of detail going on in everyday life. The ostraca at the top, and again, another fragment of pottery that's been written on, is an order from a gentleman to the carpenter named Mary Ray for a bed. So he's negotiating how much he believes a bed should cost him in this ostraca. In the papyrus below that, this is known as a London magical papyrus. And magic and medicine in Egypt was actually very closely linked. We know they didn't see it as being conflicting ideas. They were often used together. And in this papyrus, we have kind of a combination of skills on how to cure diseases, things like burns, snake bites, eye infections, etc. And a lot of these involve a recipe. So things like you see on the left, dates, ochre, salt. You have to mix that up, apply it on the wound or on some part of the body, and also say a spell, which is designated in the papyrus to make sure it has proper potency. We also have a slightly more emotional part of the personal stories. So one of the most important part was the family in ancient Egypt, and a fundamental duty of the eldest child in a family was to care for their parents. In this letter in front of us, a gentleman named Butahamen writes to a troop commander he's expressing some concerns about his father, who's going with the troop commander on a trip down to Nubia in the south, modern Sudan. Butahamen asks the troop commander, please look after him, my father, with vigilance in the evening as well, while he's in your hands. So it's a very nice, kind letter about his concerns for his elderly father. And because family was very important to Egyptians, they wanted to protect them in any way possible. Another thing that we see is gods being called in to protect family members. Often people had amulets, such as this one, to protect people from evil. This goddess is named Taweret. She's a hippopotamus goddess, and possibly because of her similarity to pregnant women with the large belly and the pendulous breasts, she is often in charge of protecting pregnant women, mothers, and children. One of the interesting personal stories that crosses back over into that concept of time that we were talking about earlier is this papyrus. This is my favorite object. It's the calendar of lucky and unlucky days. Days in ancient Egypt often had mythological significance to do with the gods, which may have been influenced by actual natural phenomena such as the weather, the flooding of the Nile, the winds that come every year. And so calendars like these were drawn up to specify days as lucky or unlucky, or good and bad. You can see the third month of Accetta, day 14, is a very dangerous day. You're not supposed to do anything on this day. The hearts of the gods are very sad because of what's been done against Osiris, the god of the dead. So this is when he's been murdered in the mythology. And they say anyone who is born on this day dies in a massacre similar to Osiris. So I'm not going to tell you what day it is because I don't want to worry anybody, but trust me, this doesn't definitely happen. It's just a belief. Of course, none of this would be possible without the people who are doing the writing. We believe in ancient Egypt, most people could not read or write. A lot of these stories or a lot of this information would have been transmitted orally and then written down by people that we know as scribes. So the scribes trained for many years, although not all scribes learned how to write in hieroglyphs, which are reserved for formal and religious monuments. Many were trained in the cursive handwritten scripts called hieratic and demotic that we mentioned earlier. And they were used to produce kind of everyday bureaucratic notation, letters, contracts, marriage certificates, divorce decrees, etc. Becoming a scribe was very prestigious. You wanted that for your son if it was possible, because he had a lot of power. Part of that power, of course, being his writing, but part of it also being that they knew a lot of information about people. Secrets, for instance, if you wanted to commission a letter to be written or a contract or a divorce decree, you had to go to your local scribe. Scribes wrote sitting down, like you see in this beautiful statue on loan from the Louvre, with a papyrus or a writing board in their lap. And they used things like reed pens that were kept in palettes, like you see on the right. And these palettes also had red and black ink for them. To end the exhibition, we wanted to bring back the idea that this language was a spoken language. So this object we thought was quite appropriate. It's called the Rosetta Stone, named after the king who commissioned the inscription to be made. The text claims in its introduction to be a copy of an ancient worm-eaten papyrus the pharaoh found, and he was worried that it was going to be lost forever. So he ordered it to be carved on stone so that it's preserved for eternity. And it was almost erased by the later reuse as a millstone, we believe. But ultimately, this succeeded because here we are, 2,732 years later, still looking at this, which I think is quite incredible. The story on the stone is the story of creation by the god Ptah. Ptah creates the universe by reading aloud names of gods, people, cities, and temples. And this brings it really full circle from ancient Egyptian being a spoken language used by this amazing complex society to being lost and just symbolic objects and letters that we're seeing on the walls that do not understand. And now again, here we can read this once again, and by reading it, we're giving life back to these amazing people, the ancient Egyptians, who we are lucky enough to be able to study through their words themselves. I just wanted to very quickly say a thank you to our wonderful lenders for loaning us objects which have enabled us to tell this story of the journey and impact of decipherment, and for allowing us to use images of some of the fantastic loan items in this presentation. I'm now going to pass back over to Ilona, who's going to share some questions that's been gathered from you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, there's quite a few questions. I will try to deal with all of them briefly. The depiction of hieroglyphs, did the depiction of hieroglyphs change at all during the Amarna period in line with general art? In short, not so much the depiction of hieroglyphs, but some parts of the names would have been carved out. So if there is a name that was composed with one of the names of one of the gods that was not the sun god, not the sun disk, that King Akhenaten really wanted to push forward as the single or the most important god, then that would be replaced. The most famous example probably being Tutankhamun, which for a brief period is attested in other places as Tutankhaten, and then changed back to Tutankhamun later on in his life. Question 2, when different scripts were combined, like Greek and Arabic, which directions did they from left to right, and Arabic reads from right to left, like hieratic, and most of the cursive writing we have from ancient Egypt reads from right to left. And so in the Rosetta Stone, yeah, you have to read the first two scripts from right to left, and then you have to switch, which sometimes I forget, and I point to the Greek text and then I start reading from right to left, which is silly, of course, because I'm so used to reading from right to left. Yeah, so they had to pay attention when they were writing, that they had to swap the writing direction. The papyrus with the Coptic and Arabic alchemical text is not really named. I just refer to it as an alchemical text, which is, it's basically a magical text, an interpretation of some symbols. So for example, the symbol for sun becomes gold, which is very much in line with the with alchemy of the time, which develops, as we know, into modern chemistry. Question 4, hieratic is much more difficult to read than hieroglyphs, so how was it deciphered? So hieroglyphs and demotic were deciphered together, basically, and hieratic was an earlier version of demotic, and so representing the same language, following the same writing system, the same structure, the same grammar. So once they deciphered hieroglyphs and demotic, it was quite easy to then also apply the same structure and readings to hieratic. In fact, much of the hieratic, and especially the earlier versions of hieratic, so if we have beautiful hieratic of the Middle Kingdom, you can actually still recognize the hieroglyphs. So some of them are still visually very close to their hieroglyphic equivalent, and so it makes it a little bit easier to read, definitely, than demotic, which is very cursive. Many Egyptian stones are very pristine looking and clean cut. Is that the condition in which they were found, or have they been restored and re-chiseled? Restored, yes. Re-chiseled, no. We don't do this. So of course the objects, especially the ones that go into the exhibition, as well as objects in our permanent display, are conserved. We do a minimal conservation, not so much a restoration. Sometimes, like in the case of the lintel of Amenemhat, which we display as our first object in the exhibition, it's also the one that is on the poster. There we have a reconstruction of the right part, because the lintel is the same. It's basically a mirror image directed to the central name of the king. So there we could do this, but we only do it if we, of course, are absolutely sure that we can reconstruct the hieroglyphs. But we don't intervene into the object, into the writing, if in any way that is not reversible. So everything we do has to be reversible. In case there is a new method in 5 or 10 years, we have to be able to undo modern restorations. Question 6, what is the difference between demotic, hieratic, and Coptic? The difference is the script. So hieratic is a handwritten version of hieroglyphs. Demotic is the advanced development of that. It's more cursive, it's more abbreviated. And Coptic is basically the alphabetic script in which the ancient Egyptian language was written. So all of the 3 scripts reflect the same language. Does the museum still have the frame used to protect the stone when displayed in the 19th century? I don't actually know this. I would assume they do. I hope they do. We do tend to keep these kind of historical displays, so I think so, but I'm not 100% sure, unless you know, Kelly. But I think we do, or at least part of it. Which king's name was shown on the object shown as the example of the concept of time? I think the question is referring to the long ceramic jar. The name that is mentioned there is Sechen Ka, Sechen or Ka. We don't really know how to read it, and this is interesting because the name is written with the Ka arms, which is basically the hieroglyph depicting the shoulders and the 2 arms going up like this. But in the very early period, so the object dates to the to 3100 BC, when Egypt was not yet a unified state. So it's a ruler, it's a king in a way, but not of a unified Egypt, not of the the entire country. It's a ruler of an area in Upper Egypt, in the south of Egypt. And at that time, which we call the pre-dynastic period, the hieroglyphs are they're much more flexible with writing because they're still developing their own system. And so the Ka arms can be written like this, which you would read Ka, or they can be written the other way around, which would be Sechem. And we have many versions of this name, really many, about 100, I think. And we can see that they swap the arms, the hieroglyphs. So we don't really know whether it was Ka or Sechem. But it's the oldest inscription we have in the British Museum, 3100 BC. Was it a monotheistic society? No. Only during the Amarna period, Akhenaton tried to elevate one of the sun god, basically, which didn't last very long because the Egyptians were too connected and too attached to their many, many gods. And very soon, immediately after the reign of Akhenaton, they go back to their polytheistic society. When was writing given to a select few? Yes, so very few people, as Kelly also mentioned, could read or write. Definitely, it was an elite profession that was passed on from father to son. And they would have learned probably in a school attached to a temple. And many of the scribes would first have learned hieratic or demotic, depending on the period of history. And only then a few would go on to also learn to carve hieroglyphs, because it's a very different skill set in a way. To carve beautiful hieroglyphs is almost requires an artist or a sculptor rather than just a scribe. So these two things were very different. As Kelly also mentioned, most people would have enjoyed writing through recitations, performances, or would go to a village scribe and have their will written or their contract made. And yeah, so very few people were actually writing themselves. What did they make the ink from? So most of the writing is then referring again to the cursive handwritten sources, which must have been the majority in ancient Egypt. They have not preserved as well as monumental hieroglyphic inscriptions, but we must assume that most of the writing was in handwriting and was written on organic material that have not so well preserved. On that material, they wrote in black ink and red ink, which was basically carbon-based and ochre-based, so natural materials that they found in the environment and that were cheap also. How were the various characters and symbols of Egyptian Coptic ancient Greeks etched into the Rosetta Stone, and how long did you think it would have taken to produce the document in full on the stone? Yeah, this is a very good question. The motic was actually not that suitable to carve in stone. Most of the documents we have in the motic are papyrus or pottery or limestone ostraca, and very few examples exist of the motic carved in stone like the Rosetta Stone. We think that the Rosetta Stone was quite a prestigious object because it's carved in granodiorite, whereas some of the other siblings that you saw in the family tree are carved into limestone, which is much easier available in Egypt. So if they have the granodiorite, they would probably have put their best scribe to do that, because you don't want to come halfway and then find a mistake and have to start all over again. But it's difficult to say how long it exactly took. This is, I mean, a long time, I assume. It's very difficult to say. Could anyone be a scribe? Was there a scribe school where the pharaohs themselves literate? That is a good point. Some pharaohs boast the fact that they could write and read themselves, which makes me believe that maybe not all of them did. But of course, they are part of the elite layer of Egyptian society, so they would have had some kind of education. Not everyone could be a scribe. This was a very elite profession, and yeah, it was also to a certain extent, at least depending again on the period. I mean, we have to remember that we're talking about 4,000 years during which practices change a lot and develop a lot, but it was very much an elite venture. Is computer analysis now being used to decipher more of the text? Yeah, this is a question I get regularly. I'm quite a traditional Egyptologist, and there are not many jobs for Egyptologists. So I'd like to think that we are needed, and we can probably more quickly translate the text ourselves. Experiments are being made, but because the hieroglyphic script is very complicated, the fonts are not really suitable to do something like artificial intelligence or automatic translation. There is the additional difficulty that they were very fluid with their spelling. So words could be spelled in many different ways. So you would have to teach a computer all the different possible spellings of one word, which is really complicated. The number of signs that would have been used is more or less in the classical period of Egyptian history is about 650, and all of them can be used in many, many, many different ways. So it would be, I think it would last very long to teach a computer how to read hieroglyphs. I would probably have read the text quicker myself. So experiments are being made, and of course it's something that we have to look into. There is a lot of collaboration with digital humanities at certain universities, but I'm yet still to be convinced that this is going to help us very soon, that there would be some kind of Champollion computer. I'm not so yeah, positive about that yet, but who knows? I think I covered all the questions. Yes. So if there are no more questions, I guess this is it for me. And then I'm only left to wish you all a very nice evening, and thank you all very, very much for joining us in this conversation, in this journey of how we discovered and rediscovered ancient Egypt through its writing system. And I hope you all liked it, and I hope that we see all of you again during the next discussion on the 10th of November. Thank you very much.